Beautiful. And I'm picking up me, but I could be picking up me some more. That's already at 10. That's kind of weird. La la la. That only got me halfway. La. Well, I will try to speak up. That's much better. And let's see. So we are recording now. And I'm getting just a little bit of a funny bar, so let me try a filter to get the lighting better. That doesn't do anything.
Would it help with the overhead lights off and just this desk light? Would that give you a better contrast?
Well, I'm getting zebra bars, which supposedly does mean too much light. It means a little bit of overexposure.
Okay, once you hit that switch behind you, I'll try this. Too dark?
Yeah, I think that's going to give you a Dr. Evil effect.
Okay.
I think we'll go with a little bit of overexposure. Okay. It'll be fine. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit now. So just so you know, I've basically just got you, and I've got a nice shot of you at your desk for context. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
You're welcome.
Would you please tell me your name and claim to fame and areas of expertise?
Tim Longo, I'm the Chief of Police in the city of Charlottesville, Virginia.
How does the city of Charlottesville Police Department currently use polygraphs?
Well, we typically use them in pre-screening of employees. We can, by policy, use them in the investigation of administrative complaints against police officers. And we certainly can use them in the context of a criminal investigation, although that's rare.
Okay. Under what circumstances might an investigator choose to polygraph an alleged crime victim?
One set of circumstances could be either to confirm or dispel the allegations that are being made by the victim. If there comes a time where the investigator, whether it be an administrative investigator or a criminal investigator, has questions with respect to the veracity or credibility of any source, whether it be a victim, a witness, or a suspect, a polygraph may be a useful tool, but only as an investigative aid. Certainly no sustained findings or no conclusions are drawn necessarily from the results of the polygraph, but the instrument may direct the detective or the investigator in a direction that he or she might not have otherwise been prone to kind of go down and to pursue.
So let's say an alleged child molester passes a polygraph. What does the investigator do with that information?
Well, we have not, in my tenure here, I don't know that we've necessarily used the instrument under those circumstances, but it would not definitively excuse that particular suspect as being the focus of the investigation. It may be that particular person may have given what we would call a false negative in this particular case. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are not the abuser. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were not deceptive in their response. It may be that the physiological aspects that the instrument is measuring may have been controlled by the suspect as he or she is being interviewed. So it would not excuse that particular individual from continuing to be the focus of that investigator's investigation.
Okay. Are all departmental polygraph exams audio and or video recorded?
Well, we don't do the examinations here. We don't have a polygraphist or someone who is certified to be able to administer the polygraph examination. That would be done if it were a criminal case, more likely than not by the Virginia State Police. If it's an administrative case and or a pre-employment screening, it would be done by a licensed private contractor who would administer polygraph examinations. They typically can be audio recorded. I don't know that they necessarily are. My guess is that if it were a polygraph being conducted for the purpose of a criminal investigation, it would be, much like all our other interviews, both audio and visually recorded.
But for pre-employment screening, it doesn't sound like...
Doesn't sound like they typically are, although the release that the individual signs during the pre-screening process that is drafted by and administered by the polygraphist. It does allow for the recording, audio recording of the polygraph if in fact the person being interviewed wishes to have that done or accomplished. It's not necessarily something that we require of the polygraphist when he or she is conducting the pre-screening, employment screening polygraph.
Okay. So how many polygraphs are usually given in the course of an investigation, or if an investigator is using them, or a pre-employment screening, or an internal investigation?
Well, the answers to all those questions are fact-driven. In a pre-screen, for employment purposes, it's typically one polygraph examination. What will happen is we will go through the employment process and get to a point in that process where the polygraph becomes a relevant tool. We'll then send the potential employee to the polygraphist who will go over the predetermined questions that he or she will ask of the applicant, but also do some general questions to kind of set a baseline for the test, and then administer it. It's a rare occasion that we may ask the polygraphist to go back and re-polygraph a candidate. And the vast majority of those candidates that are pre-screened polygraphed prior to being given a firm offer of employment are non-deceptive findings. Sometimes there's an inconclusive finding, sometimes there's a deceptive findings, but those are rare. And what we do with that tool or that instrument is we use it as yet another aid to make an employment decision. Prior to that applicant ever getting polygraphed, they're interviewed by staff, and they're also subjected to a very comprehensive written questionnaire. So, for example, if one of the questions that are either inconclusive or deceptive is, have you ever used illegal drugs? We can then go back to the employment questionnaire and see how that individual may have answered the question when he or she completed that. And we'll also use the basis of that response during the completion of the background investigation. But we don't typically make any firm decisions based solely on the results of that examination, particularly if it shows deception. So, long answer to a pretty simple question: how many times? Typically only once in the context of the pre-employment setting. During the course of the administrative investigation, it simply depends on what the nature of the allegation is or how complex the investigation is, and the necessity to re-polygraph an individual after the initial test may have been given. It just depends on the nature of the investigation and what it is we're trying to get to. Is it a fact-specific, did you or did you not steal money from Mr. Smith's house during that particular investigation? Did you or did you not steal money from Mr. Smith's vehicle incident to his or her arrest? Depends on the nature of the investigation. With respect to the criminal investigation, same response. It would depend largely on the nature of the investigation, what it is the investigator is trying to get from the suspect or witness that he or she feels the polygraph may be a useful tool. Again, it's a much more rare usage of the device in the context of municipal policing, at least in my experience. More often you'll see it used in the context of the administrative process, not so much in the criminal process, but it is, in fact, it is a viable tool, but it's up to the investigator and those involved in the prosecution, subsequent prosecution of that case, to determine whether or not this may be a viable investigative aid.
Right. If you do a Google News search on polygraph, what comes up across a long period of time in the top 20 hits or so is police using it in criminal investigations. So and so was detained following a deceptive polygraph. Are you using this tool as a diagnostic tool to determine truth or deception, or are you using it as an interrogation tool?
Well, I don't know if you're asking the question specifically or generally. If you're asking it specifically, I can't answer that because the times that I can't, off the top of my head, recall in the 9 years I've served as the chief of police here, when we may have used a polygraph in a criminal investigation. It's possible that we have. My guess would be it would be for the determination of truth or deception. I think the reason why you get so many hits initially and what hits the top of the radar screen is because when it's being used in the context of criminal cases and it's being used as the basis for a detention, you've triggered the Constitution. Now, you could arguably trigger the Constitution in the context of an administrative proceeding, depending on what you use that test for subsequently, but you're more likely to trigger it in the context of criminal investigation. So it's what's going to create a more, not necessarily newsworthy, but from an academic perspective, where are you going to get more value in studying the implications of using this tool? By looking at whether I'm using it in an internal affairs investigation or pre-screening for an employee, or in the context of you've made a detention decision based on the results of a test, which legal significance has been called into question as to whether it's even competent evidence. So that's why you get 20 hits in the context of criminal proceedings. It's not, I don't know that it's necessarily because it's used more in that context, but the consequences and implications are far more significant.
Has anyone ever been fired from CPD over a polygraph result?
That I recall.
Denied a job?
I'd have to go back and look at individual files. I've hired about 90 people in the last 9 years. So it'd be difficult for me to determine how much validity I may have given. It may be that subsequent to finding of deception, additional inquiries are made of that applicant that may reveal information which could result in a decision not to employ them. For example, the finding is either inconclusive or deceptive as to whether you've ever stolen anything of a value of $25 or greater from a previous employer, and you've shown deceptive. And there's nothing in that background questionnaire that would have triggered a deceptive response. We may now go back to that employee and say, look, here's our dilemma. You've answered certain questions relating to your ability to be trusted with other people's property in a background questionnaire. You've been asked a pretty straightforward question in the polygraph exam, to which the examiner deems, based on his or her experiences, that you may be deceptive here. I need to understand why that result may have come about. And sometimes what you might get from the person is, I never really thought about it when I filled out the questionnaire, but when I was 16 and I worked at the Pilot gas station, I forgot my wallet and I took $10 out of the register for lunch, and I don't know why I forgot about it, but gee, I forgot about it. Well, let's talk about that. Has there been any other occasions? Let's say when you were working for Lowe's. Was there ever a time when maybe you might have taken the property of Lowe's and converted it to your own personal use and not paid for it? Well, there was that time when I needed a filter for my car, and well, that's how the polygraph is used as an investigative aid. It points you in a direction you might not otherwise have gone towards based on previous responses. Now I got a potential deceptive finding on theft. Let's talk more about that. Let's be a little bit more specific. Let's talk about your first job and walk you through the one up to the time you filed this application to make sure that you understand what I'm asking you. And sometimes from that series of follow-up questions, you'll get that. I took the $10 out of the register. I took the motor oil from the car place where I was working. At the time, it's a $4 can of motor oil, and I'm not, I'll pay them back somehow, and I just forgot. And now all of a sudden, 5 years later, you're asking me about this, and now it's coming back to me. And maybe that's why when Mr. So-and-so asked me about stealing from a previous employer, boom, it hit me between the eyes, and I wasn't sure how to answer because I couldn't remember how I answered in the previous questionnaire. So there's a variety of reasons why that deceptive finding is going to point you in a direction you might not otherwise have gone towards. And if I went back and I looked at those 90-some people that we've looked at over the past several years and the ones we didn't hire, maybe that there's a handful of them like that, but I can't answer without going back and really looking at those individual files.
Okay.
But that's how that would be triggered.
Okay. Are there any incentives for getting confessions during polygraphs?
What do you mean by incentives?
in terms of cash incentives or promotions or anything of that nature?
No. No, it's an investigative tool like any other one that we would use. There's nothing attached to it that would encourage or discourage someone from taking it. Now, arguably, as you found in some of the research that you've done, the fact that you have a policy that says, oh, by the way, we got this really neat tool that has some value that could tell me perhaps whether you're honest or dishonest. And if I ever think you're dishonest, I could pull this tool out and you could go through a series of tests and maybe bring some clarity to my suspicions. So you might want to be careful and tell me the truth when I ask you a question. Now, some would say that's an incentive because I don't want to take that test. I don't want to be subject to that line of questioning. I don't want somebody put me on a machine and measuring how fast my heart beats. So you know what? I think I'll tell him the truth and not ever have to worry about that. Some could argue that the mere presence of a policy that says, I can use this, I could pull this tool out if I need it, is an incentive not to falsify.
A deterrent.
It's a deterrent. Well, yeah, it's an incentive because you'll keep your job if you tell the truth.
Okay.
There's the incentive because in policing, you know, it sounds hokey to say, well, our word is everything, but the fact of the matter is, it's a matter of law. Because as a primary fact witness for the government, when we take the witness stand, our credibility is subject to cross-examination. And there's a line of cases that says, when we get to the point where your credibility is now impeachment evidence, it gets turned over to the defense, and now you're perhaps tainted from ever taking that witness stand again. So in effect, you become incapacitated as a law enforcement officer because you serve me no value if I can't trust you at your word. So the incentive is, if you want to keep your job, you tell the truth. Otherwise, you're no good to me. So when I say incentive, that's what I'm talking about. That's the incentive. You get to keep your job. You kept to stay. It's an absolute. Today is a great incentive.
Are you aware of any cases in which, well, I guess you don't look at the polygraph charts or transcripts yourself?
No, I get a report from the polygraphist. I get a basic report that says, he sent Tim Longo to see me. I understand he's an applicant to the Charlottesville Police Department. I'll be met on such and such a date and such a time. We went through the following series of introductory questions. I explained to him the process that we would undertake over the next hour or two, whatever the time period is that we're together. And I reviewed with him the polygraph questions, and here's what they are. There's 10 of them. And here were his responses to those questions, and here are my findings based on those responses. That's what I see. I don't see the charts that the polygraphist would use to get to that determination or that final report.
So if there's a discrepancy between what the polygraphist indicates an applicant feels or thinks based on the polygraph results and what the applicant says, or even what the applicant says he or she said during the exam, how do you mediate that?
Well, it would, my guess is it would only become relevant when the findings are such that there's either deception or inconclusion. Otherwise, if the applicant has passed his or her polygraph, it's a non-issue. There's no reason to continue to further consider, talk about, or otherwise discuss that polygraph or its findings. So it would only become an issue if, in fact, it now is causing me to do other things or go in other directions. In which case, when I sit down with that applicant and say, you know, Mr. So-and-so asked you about stealing from a previous employer. You said no. He says, based on my experience as polygraph examiner, I see an indication of deception here. Talk to me about that. Whoa, wait a minute. Yeah, I said no, and he never once indicated to me that there was any concern. In fact, he said, great, good luck to you, have a great career. So I'm a little confused here, Chief. Well, then we pick up the phone, we talk to the polygraph examiner, and we say, you know, show us whatever notes or reports that you might have. Talk to us about this test, because here's what he's telling me, or here's what she's telling me, here's what your report says, and we got to resolve this inconsistency. So the opportunity to have to do those kinds of things are few and far between, because the areas where that's been relevant for me, at least in 9 years, have been few and far between. But that's how you would resolve it, because all I'm getting is a report.
Right. So it sounds like you're putting the accuracy rate of the polygraph as a tool pretty high. If you could put a numerical value on it or a range, what would that be?
Well, I think the greater tool is not so much his examination or her examination, depending on who the polygraphist is, because they're either confirming or dispelling what the traditional background investigation has already discovered. Because remember, not only do we have this initial background questionnaire, we've done the interview with the potential applicant, we've talked to prior employers, we've gotten personal references, we conducted a criminal history check, we looked at the calls for service to their home, we've talked to neighbors, we've gotten a pretty good sense for the character of the person. This test is either going to confirm or dispel that character, that conclusion, at least at that point in the investigation. So a validator is I guess what I would consider the test to have the potential for, to validate what we think we know with respect to this particular potential employee. Do I give it more weight than I give my background investigation? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that's a more thorough. Now, I talk to agencies about these issues all the time, and here's what I say about the polygraph. You make the decision on how much weight you want to give it. And you either choose to use it or don't use it. And there are organizations that don't. But if you use it for everyone. Don't use it discriminately. In other words, don't pick and choose when you want to use this tool. Because I think if you do that, then you're more likely to run into issues with respect to the decisions you will make as a result of what it tells you. Because I've seen situations over the years, 28 years in this business, where in the context of pre-employment screening, that background investigator will make the judgment. I'm not getting a good feeling about this gal. It's her smile or it's her hesitation in certain responses. It's that beautiful pin on her jacket is what it is. I'm not getting a good feeling about her, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put her on the test. Well, that's not the way to do it. If you're going to do it for her, do it for every applicant you have. Don't pick and choose. Then I think you'll run into problems with the tool. I don't know that answered your question, but I look at it as one piece of that background investigation. And it either validates or doesn't what I've already, I think, know about this potential candidate.
Okay, so as a validator, sort of high validity, high accuracy, but it is proportionate to the background investigation, these other things. It's just one tool among many.
Absolutely. As it should be, by the way. As it should be.
Is it the department's position that equal opportunity law does apply to the hiring process?
Absolutely.
So what do you think of the evidence that there are systematic racial or other biases in polygraphs?
I guess I'd have to see the evidence.
I sent it to you.
Yeah. I guess I'd have to look at it again.
Okay. There was a 1990 racial bias study done at the Department of Defense Polygraph Institute, which is now DACA, but was dogpie, and it indicated that innocent blacks were substantially more likely to be incorrectly deemed deceptive than innocent whites.
I guess the question then becomes, as it does with any allegations of discrimination, as to whether it was intentional discrimination or it's discriminatory as it's applied to a particular group. I guess I'd have to know more about the circumstances under which, one, the decision was made to even use the polygraph.
Oh, this was at training school. This was at the Federal Polygraph Training Facility. And this was, people who'd been FBI investigators for 20 years before they were sent to this school. This was not new investigators.
Mm-hmm.
It was an observational study. They didn't intend to do it ahead of time. Researcher pulled the data and went, oh, let's see how this breaks down.
Who were the subjects of the polygraph? How were the subjects of the polygraph chosen?
They were dealing with mock criminal investigations with DACA employees.
Mm-hmm. And were all the suspects of those investigations subjected to the polygraph?
Yes.
All of them were?
Yes.
What was the percentage of of all the cases that were subject to investigation and then later subject to polygraph, what was the breakdown racially of the potential suspects?
I don't know.
Was it equally distributed?
No, I'm sure it wasn't 50-50 because that would have been too obvious.
Was it 60-40, 70-30? I mean, that's relevant. It's for example.
Well, if the N was already 1,100 polygraph exams, then I'm not sure how relevant the breakdown is, because you're still dealing with a fairly large number of folks.
I guess the reason I asked the question is I would look at it this way. Let's say, for example, that there was an allegation in front of us that a disproportionately large number of African Americans were being stopped in traffic violations in a particular part of any city. It would be relevant to know what percentage of that community, both people who live there and who move throughout that community on a given day, are African American versus Caucasian.
Absolutely, but this was a rate of deception indicated that was incorrect DI sort of ranking. This was not absolute.
Gotcha. I have to go back and read your study.
Absolutely, I'll send it to you again.
The one that I did read was the one that you encouraged me to read, and particularly the executive summary, and I also read the case attachment to that, from the Holy, was it Holy or Choli case?
Oh yeah, Winholy.
Winholy. But I didn't get a chance to read the subsequent stuff that you sent, but I would. And if I have an opinion, I'll email it to you.
Thank you, I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I guess that you just triggered something I need to reemphasize when you asked the equal employment opportunity question. That's not the only reason, but it, in my opinion, is an important reason not to use that test in a discriminate way. In other words, you can't always know what's in someone's heart as to whether they're intentionally discriminating against another person. Sometimes it's a little more subconscious than that.
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be the polygraph, or it could be something called stereotype threat, where people have, maybe a physiological fear or stress response.
Right.
You don't know what the mechanism is. You just know based on this data there is a racial bias.
So if you're going to use the tool in the context of pre-employment, then use it for everybody or don't use it at all.
But if it's used on everybody and blacks have a higher aggregate false positive rate, then that's systematic racial discrimination.
And so you would argue then the tool should not be used at all.
Absolutely. Also because it has a 39% margin of error, so you might as well flip a coin.
Yeah. Well, I hope to never flip a coin to make employment decisions.
Yeah. How many polygraphs have you taken?
One, maybe two in 28 years.
Any problems?
Yeah, actually one there was. First one I took was inconclusive.
Oh.
Yeah. That was when I was 18 years old and I applied for the Maryland State Police.
Did the examiner tell you that there were any questions in particular that were giving you trouble?
I believe we did. I'm trying to think if I went back and retook it. I think I did. I think I passed. And I was already working for the Baltimore City Police. I can't specifically recall. But those were the two times I took a test. In Baltimore, not everyone was subjected to the polygraph. There was the opinion of the background investigator as to whether he or she would use it. That's it.
Interesting. So, as a concerned citizen, I want you to stop using the polygraph. What evidence would be sufficient for you to make that call?
A lot of what we do in this business is governed by what we consider best practices. And we adopt what others consider to be best practices in most everything we do. Whether it's how we do a lineup photographically in the context of a criminal investigation, whether it's how we do an administrative investigation in the context of an internal affairs investigation, all of what we do is based on best practices. If this industry of mine, either through the International Association of Chiefs of Police or the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, could be reasonably persuaded based on evidence that this tool is is an ineffective means by which to get to the truth, then I think I would be persuaded. I'll be very candid with you. I'm not an advocate of the polygraph. I don't have a tremendous amount of confidence in the polygraph. But I don't make the decisions based solely on the results of the polygraph. So, having said that, I rely more heavily on other aspects of the investigations that we do. If this were a situation where I was making decisions based solely on a finding, I don't know that I'd use it as a tool at all, because I don't have enough confidence in it to be able to do that. I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but I think it's important to understand that in an industry like this, it's going to take more than, I guess you can start by convincing one police chief at a time, which I suspect is what you're trying to do. But at the end of the day, there are 17,000 plus police agencies across this country who rely very heavily on the standards that are set by the IACP and their state and regional chiefs of police associations, who will take a position. You know, we think that this is best practice, or we think that it's not. And you know, we encourage you to consider. You know, we can't run your department, chief or sheriff. That's why you're employed. If you're a sheriff, that's why you're elected. If you're a chief, that's why you're appointed. It's got to be your call. But we encourage you to apply this best practice, or to move away from this process, which we've determined not to be, for all the reasons that you pointed out, because of the margin of error, the potential discriminatory impact, or adverse impact that it could have on a particular race or group of people in a disproportionate way.
Right. The National Academy of Sciences chair testified before the Senate that the use of the polygraph was actually a national security threat. You know, how can I get you to respond to that threat? But you know, it's true that I think the implication, what I'm getting from you, is that you want another group to make the decision. But I'm looking at the evidence. I'm looking at how NAS, you know, testified before the Senate. You know, Jim Woolsey would like for the CIA to completely stop using the polygraph in pre-employment screenings. And the psychophysiology community really dismisses this as a truth-telling tool, as a matter of forensics. It's not scientific, and that's the consensus.
Well, it's arguably not scientific or competent enough to be admitted in a court of law. So.
Right. But still, it is used so widely, and all I know to do is bring it back home, right, and go, can we stop it in my backyard?
I don't know that, and maybe it is a fair characterization to say, hey, look, Longo, you're saying I'll do it if others do it. I mean, it's like, I don't want to be out there by myself, and I'm not really saying that. What I'm saying is that what I do and what I don't do affects other agencies across the state and around the country. I want to make sure that the profession, whether you do it one chief at a time, but ultimately your goal, I suspect, is to not force, but encourage an entire profession of investigators, whether it be in Charlottesville, Virginia, or Tacoma, Washington, that, you know what, there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't be using this tool, and here's what they are. And do that in a broad way, so that it not only is a discussion in your backyard, but it's a discussion at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference next year, or it's a discussion at the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police Conference this year, which I encourage you to put your bid in as a potential presenter for one of those workshops, to get other chiefs talking and thinking about whether or not this is a useful tool or not. You know, I'm not sure that it would affect how I do business one way or the other if I said today I'm not going to use this tool anymore, because we don't use it a lot now. If we use it for pre-employment screening, that's about the extent of its use in any widespread fashion. I mean, again, I can't remember, although there may be times in the last 9 years when it was used in the context of a criminal case. I can't remember specifically when that was, or for what purpose. And again, that's where I think although one could argue you could trigger some equal employment opportunity issues in pre-employment screening, the consequences are really significant from a constitutional perspective when you're making decisions of detention or prosecution or charging based on the results of a particular examination, which has no scientific validity in the context of being deemed competent evidence such that it's admissible in a criminal proceeding. So, again, that's where I think if I had to pick or choose where I'd want to convince agencies to stop using it, I'd probably start there. I think because the consequences are more significant.
Might as well shut it all down at once.
Baby steps.
Quis custodia ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guardians?
That document that was ratified in 1791 and really constitutionally was applied to all people in 1868, but then again we see through the civil rights movement that wasn't really the case either. That document that stands for those principles, which is the screensaver on this computer, is safeguarded by the people who wear this uniform and carry this badge. This badge stands for you and everyone else that's in this community. So my job is to safeguard the constitutional rights of the people who live here. That's my position.
But if, as a guardian, there is something that you're doing that is wrong, whose job is it to change that?
Marbury versus Madison would say it would be the job of the Supreme Justice of the United States Supreme Court to determine which laws run afoul of the Constitution and jeopardize the individual rights of citizens who live in this country. But having said that, I think it's a collective responsibility for those of us who stand in the protection of that document and all that it stands for. I mean, ultimately, it's the Supreme Court that gets to say what's unconstitutional or not. And if you put forth an argument that it violates the Equal Protection Clause, or that it violates the Equal Employment Opportunity provisions of federal law, or that it jeopardizes someone's confrontation rights in a criminal proceeding, whatever argument you put forth, all of which are constitutional, ultimately, the Supreme Court of the United States is going to have to say to people like me, you have to stop doing this, because it runs afoul of the Constitution. But at the end of the day, if those of us who are tasked with the responsibility of enforcing and upholding that Constitution can be reasonably persuaded that we run the risk of creating that argument, which someday might be at the doorstep of the Supreme Court, then I think we have an obligation to take reasonable steps to prevent that from happening and not just sit back and wait for somebody to say it's wrong. And you have to stop doing it. And I can be reasonably persuaded to do that. And I think others can be as well. But because it's a decision that has to be taken responsibly, I mean, I guess we just need to look at the data that you and others have so dutifully assembled, and to the extent we're capable of reading some of that stuff that can be written in a fairly foreign language, I think we have an obligation to do so. And I think, if you want to continue to make your point, then you really need to do it in a much broader way. You need to make sure that your voice is heard across the Commonwealth to people like me who may or may not even use the tool. Because that's how best practices are created. The first person that was released from prison as a result of the Innocence Project, and now there's 200 people that have been released. Over that time, we created best practices, just in the way we present photo lineups, because of one triggering event. This shouldn't happen. Well, why did it happen? Let's research how it happened. And let's talk about suggestibility and all the other things that lead to that.
Jeff Deskovich was a 16-year-old boy in upstate New York when he was polygraphed in connection with the rape murder case 18 years ago. He spent 16 years in prison following that polygraph examination before the Innocence Project exonerated him.
Mm-hmm. Based on?
The polygraph.
It's a work in progress.
But you're in a position to change it now.
Well, in your backyard. And maybe one could argue in doing that it sets an example for others, but I'm not sure, based on the number of times that we use that tool, how much influence I'm going to have on the Richmond Police Department, Virginia Beach Police Department, the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, these large agencies across this country that may use these tools in ways you and I haven't even thought about yet. So I don't, yeah, and I guess my responsibility is to these 40-some thousand people and those who pass through this community on a given day and might find themselves subject to the jurisdiction of this police department in some fashion. But by the same token, it's a very small number of people and a very small percentage of times that this tool was ever even used here. And I can clearly say that in 9 years we've never convicted anyone of a crime based on the result of the polygraph. Whether or not we've made an employment decision based solely on that, I can feel pretty confident saying we have not. Was it a tool to lead us down another road? Probably so, but even those numbers are small. So my impact would be very small, you would argue, but it would be profound because it's an example that others might follow.
And it matters to everybody who would have gone through the process, who might have had, their life dream derailed in some way by this tool that's not scientific, it's not admissible in court.
Well, I think, and again, I'd have to go back and look at files, but the derailing comes, at least in my experience, in the decisions that I've made, when I go back after the result of this test and I begin asking you hard questions. And now I begin finding things that you didn't tell me. I'll give you a quick example. I probably shouldn't because I think the numbers are so small here that it could have the potential of identifying someone, and I don't want to do that. But I can tell you that there have been experiences where the result of deception on that test did result in a series of questions that disclosed a whole lot of information about a potential candidate we might not have otherwise at least immediately learned of. I would like to think that sans the polygraph, we'd have learned about him anyway if we did a good job at a background investigation. But one might argue, but you learned about it way in the front as opposed to months later where you've invested time, energy, money, and resources in getting to your end result, which is do you make a firm offer of employment or not. But we could talk about those examples all day long, and I would hope that I haven't made a decision that's derailed someone's dream based on something that has a margin of error that's significant.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
No? Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
No. I'll resend you that research and I'll look up the International Association of Police Chiefs and I'll keep working on you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for meeting with me and listening.
You're welcome. If you turn your camera off, I'll give you a resource.